Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with a little trip back to 16th century France. So, dim the lights, get yourself comfortable, maybe grab a warm cup of something soothing. We're about to float through the quiet, slightly awkward, and occasionally tragic life of one of history's most infamous queens, Catherine de Medici. Don't worry, there won't be any loud screams or sword fights, just a gentle exploration of dynastic weirdness, courtly politics, and the subtle art of, let's say, selective problem solving. Catherine de Medici was born in 1519 in Florence, which at the time was basically the Renaissance hotspot for art, intrigue, and, if you were unlucky, endless familial scheming. She was the daughter of Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, who died tragically young. And yes, that seems to be the first of many sad notes in Catherine's life. Her father, as you might expect from a Medici, was wealthy, cultured, and generally ambitious, but not particularly good at keeping his family out of constant stress. By the time Catherine was just a child, she was effectively orphaned. Now here's an interesting thing about young Catherine. She wasn't a petite, delicate child who everyone immediately adored. She was considered plain, no soft, cherubic Renaissance beauty, and apparently a bit sickly, which, let's be honest, is a great starting point for a life where you later become one of Europe's most manipulative and powerful queens. After all, when the world underestimates you, you can quietly take over. Fast forward a few years, Catherine finds herself being promised in marriage to Henry, the second son of King Francis I of France. Not exactly the crown prince, but close enough for a Medici with ambitions of influence. And here's where we start to see the patterns that make her life endlessly fascinating for the patient history listener. Henry was not a model husband. He was immature, more interested in hunting and the occasional noble brawl than in government or, married life. Catherine, on the other hand, was forced to learn diplomacy, patience, and the subtle art of surviving courtly intrigue, which, if you think about it, is basically like being handed the world's messiest puzzle and being told, figure it out, quietly. By the time Henry becomes King Henry II of France, Catherine has learned a few important lessons. 1. Never trust your husband completely. 2. Having children is your only real leverage in a world run by men who are very interested in both mistresses and dueling. And 3. Poison, while obviously dramatic in reputation, was also occasionally just another tool in the subtle art of survival at court. People whisper about it. They speculate. But Catherine, like many of her contemporaries, was also extremely good at navigating rumor and perception. Let's float over to another aspect of Catherine's life which historians find endlessly interesting. Her children. She had 10 of them. 10! Which, if you've ever tried parenting one human, let alone 10 royal humans who are each being primed to inherit some aspect of European power, you can imagine is, well, exhausting. And yes, these children were, in the truest sense of the word, products of intense dynastic politics. Marriages were arranged to build alliances, not love. So while Catherine might have tried to instill some sense of normalcy or care in her kids, reality had other plans. There were illnesses, sudden deaths, political marriages, and a constant looming sense of, how do I keep the Valois line from falling apart? And speaking of falling apart, the Valois line was delicate. Genetically speaking, there were whispers, even in Catherine's lifetime, that some of the children looked oddly familiar in ways that suggested the family tree was being a bit recycled. It's not surprising, really. Royal marriages across Europe were basically a long chain of cousin-to-cousin arrangements. In Catherine's era, this was simply accepted as necessary for dynastic survival. But from our modern perspective, it makes for a slightly tragic comic family portrait. Children with health problems, a mother who spent her life in subtle crisis management, and a court that was constantly poised to erupt into chaos. And then there's Catherine's reputation for poison. Of course, she wasn't just a lady in the garden mixing cyanide casually. That's Hollywood exaggeration. But she was deeply involved in the politics of court intrigue, and rumor, once planted, is very hard to erase. People like to whisper about the subtle administration of herbs, ointments, and other medicinal concoctions. It's likely she experimented with subtle ways to protect her children or manipulate the court, which again, in her environment, is less villainy and more practical survival. But the legend of the Poison Queen stuck, because human imagination likes a villain with a calm smile and a glass of wine. By the mid-1500s, Catherine was deeply enmeshed in French politics. Her husband, Henry II, dies in a jousting accident, a tragedy that somehow feels almost cinematic in its irony. Suddenly, Catherine finds herself as Queen Mother, protector of her children, and basically the person everyone quietly hopes will either fail or succeed depending on their own interests. And Catherine does what she does best. She navigates the chaos. She negotiates marriages, manages rebellions, and endures the endless series of crises that define France in this era, all while maintaining that calm, slightly wearied presence, as if to say, yes, the world is terrible, yes, I am responsible, and yes, we're just going to sip our tea and get through it. Catherine's life, as you can probably tell by now, is a gentle rhythm of survival, strategy, and subtle manipulation. She was deeply aware of the fragility of life, the capriciousness of power, and the unpredictability of children who were, frankly, as much political tools as they were family. And yet, through all of this, she maintained her composure. People whispered, historians speculated, and the legend grew, but she continued, slowly, carefully, almost meditatively, which for our purposes tonight makes her a perfect subject to ponder as we drift towards sleep. We could spend a few more paragraphs on her children. Oh, her poor, poor children. But instead, let's linger a moment on the quieter side of Catherine. She loved astrology. She consulted with seers. She surrounded herself with elaborate rituals of superstition and calculation, partly because she was genuinely interested, and partly because it helped her structure an otherwise chaotic life. There's something soothing, in a sad, quiet way, about a woman at the center of Europe's most complex politics, quietly checking the stars to see if tomorrow might be tolerable. And speaking of tolerable, that brings us to the later years of Catherine's life. As her children either died, married, or assumed thrones across Europe, Catherine's role shifted. She became less a queen in the traditional sense and more a matriarch navigating a world she had largely shaped. Her health declined, her influence waned, and her legendary poison plots faded into the background of history. But still, in those quiet, reflective moments, she was a figure who had survived every misfortune the world threw at her. Not always gracefully, not always happily, but with the patient endurance that makes the study of her life endlessly calming in a slightly melancholy way. So, as we drift along with Catherine de Medici tonight, let's appreciate her, not as a villain, not as a monster, but as a human navigating impossible circumstances with quiet cunning. There's a rhythm to her life, a gentle but relentless pulse of political calculation, family management, and survival against odds that seem almost designed to crush anyone else. And yet she lasted. She endured. She became legend. And with that, we can slowly transition from Catherine to the broader tapestry of royal dysfunction in Europe. There are many more royals whose lives were marked by fragility, strange habits, and quiet tragedies. Catherine, in a sense, is just the first note in a long, soporific symphony of aristocratic misfortune that will drift through tonight.
Part 2. The Children of Catherine Valois, Chaos and Courtly Oddities. So as we ease back into the world of Catherine de Medici, let's take a moment to meet her children. 10 in total, which, if you're imagining the chaos of a single modern household with more than 3 kids, you can start to picture the mild, constant stress involved. And these weren't just any children. They were future kings, queens, and political pawns, each with their own awkward quirks, health problems, and occasional public meltdowns. It's like watching a very slow, very quiet reality show where the stakes are dynastic survival rather than Instagram likes. First up, we have Francis II, Catherine's eldest son. He became King of France at the tender age of 15, which, as you can imagine, is far too young to fully grasp what it means to be a monarch. And to add to the pressure, he was a frail young man, suffering from poor health and easily influenced by the Guise family, a powerful and ambitious noble lineage. Catherine, of course, tried to steer him, but teenagers have a way of tuning out their mothers, royal or otherwise. Francis's reign was brief, only about a year before he succumbed to illness, leaving behind a court in quiet disarray and Catherine quietly sighing at the constant unpredictability of life. Next, there's Elizabeth of Valois, who was married off to Philip II of Spain as part of a carefully calculated alliance. She was considered beautiful, more so than her mother if rumors are to be believed, and apparently sweet and well-mannered, which is lovely, except that royal marriages were rarely about happiness. Elizabeth spent much of her short life navigating a foreign court where Spanish etiquette, religion, and Philip's occasional grumpiness dominated. She died young as well, leaving Catherine with a sense of quiet grief mingled with that persistent maternal anxiety about dynastic survival. Then we move to Claude, Catherine's second daughter, who was married to Charles III, Duke of Lorraine. Claude was often overshadowed by her sisters, though she had a reputation for a slightly more practical mind. She managed her household competently, which, in a world obsessed with appearances and politicking, counts as a small victory. Catherine, ever the strategist, likely appreciated this, even if she privately wondered why her daughters could not all be simultaneously brilliant, beautiful, and politically unflappable. But now we come to Henry III, Catherine's 5th child, who will eventually become King of France. Henry III was a complicated fellow. He had a reputation for capricious, indulgent, and easily frustrated. Court observers frequently noted his eccentric tastes. He was particularly concerned with fashion, cosmetics, and the arts of subtle charm. Not exactly the warrior king that some might have hoped for. Catherine, ever patient, seemed to accept these quirks as part of the package. After all, in a family that had survived famine, disease, political coups, and general aristocratic absurdity, a son with a penchant for silk doublets seemed relatively minor. Let's pause here for a moment to acknowledge a recurring theme in Catherine's motherhood: illness. Many of her children were sickly, prone to fevers, rashes, or mysterious ailments that modern medicine can only speculate about. Inbreeding was a contributing factor, of course. The Valois family, like much of European royalty, had a long history of marrying cousins to keep power consolidated. The genetic consequences were subtle but persistent. Frailty, infertility, and sometimes strange physical traits that court gossip magnified into melodrama. Catherine, ever practical, tried to manage these concerns quietly. There was little room for emotional displays in the palace. Health crises were often handled with a calm, procedural approach: herbal remedies, rest, and constant monitoring. Now, we can't discuss Catherine's children without mentioning Margot of Valois, often called Margot. She was perhaps the most famous of Catherine's offspring, largely because of her tumultuous marriage to Henry of Navarre, the future Henry IV of France. Their wedding, meant to unite Catholics and Huguenots in peace, instead sparked the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. But let's not get too dramatic here. Remember, our aim tonight is gentle reflection, not horror. The key point is that Margaret's life was a constant series of awkward negotiations, public appearances, and attempts to survive politically while remaining personally dignified. Catherine, naturally, was deeply involved, offering advice, subtle warnings, and the occasional barely visible nudge toward more advantageous alliances. And then there were the quieter children: Charles IX, Francis, Duke of Anjou, and the lesser-known daughters who were married off strategically or lived relatively private lives. Charles IX, for example, became king at 9 years old. Imagine a child ruler with advisors, nobles, and endless political crises hovering like uninvited clouds. Catherine was effectively the regent, the steady hand guiding him, though of course history remembers Charles IX mostly for St. Bartholomew's Day, which overshadows his quieter, more vulnerable traits. The youngest children often received the same mix of affection, control, and strategic positioning. Catherine was a mother, certainly, but also a tactician. Each decision about their education, marriage prospects, or alliances was layered with long-term political calculation. It's almost soothing to think of her quietly ticking through lists of European nobles, evaluating which marriage might prevent a revolt, which might consolidate power, and which might just annoy someone enough to keep them occupied elsewhere. Now, while Catherine's children were undoubtedly shaped by her careful oversight, the court itself was a stage of endless, subtle drama. Court life was a slow-moving carousel of etiquette, rumors, and social maneuvering. Catherine had to balance the egos of her children, the ambitions of nobles, and the religious tensions that were increasingly tearing France apart. She was always aware that a single misstep, a poorly timed comment, a misplaced gift, or a subtle insult could spiral into political trouble. Her life was a series of quiet crises, resolved more often through patience and cunning than through overt action. And speaking of patience and cunning, Catherine had her own methods of self-preservation. Astrology, as mentioned earlier, played a significant role in her daily routines. She consulted seers, astrologers, and the occasional apothecary to guide her decisions. Whether these practices were deeply believed or simply a structured way to impose order on chaos, they reveal a woman intensely committed to understanding the unpredictable forces shaping her life. There's a certain soothing rhythm in imagining Catherine consulting a chart, tracing lines with a calm finger, and quietly deciding which political crisis to address first. By the 1570s, Catherine was no longer just a queen mother. She was the central node of a web of political, familial, and religious tensions. Her children's marriages had spread influence across Europe, yet these same alliances created fragile networks of dependency and rivalry. Every court appearance, every subtle negotiation, every whispered conversation had consequences. And yet, Catherine navigated it all with that same gentle, almost meditative persistence. It's worth noting that Catherine's life was punctuated by personal loss. Her children's deaths, illnesses, and occasional estrangements left marks that she carried quietly. There's a subtle poignancy in imagining her at night, walking the corridors of her palace, perhaps murmuring prayers, checking letters, or considering the next move in an endless game that had no clear end. Unlike the dramatic depictions of poison and villainy, the real power of Catherine de Medici was in her endurance, her ability to persist through quiet tragedies, and her subtle orchestration of events from behind the scenes. And so, as we drift along tonight, we can think of Catherine not as a villain, not even as a schemer in the cartoonish sense, but a woman quietly shaping her family and country with patience, calculation, and occasional mild irony. Her children, her court, her alliances, all were pieces on a chessboard she navigated with deliberate calm. There is a rhythm to this life, a slow pulse of decision-making, problem-solving, and survival that is almost hypnotic in its consistency. With that, we can gently transition from Catherine and her children to a broader exploration of French royal eccentricities, the subtle tragedies of Valois rule, and the quieter disasters that shaped European dynasties. There are more royals, more stories, and more slow-moving intrigues to drift through tonight, all in the same calm, slightly snarky tone that allows us to observe history without urgency, without alarm, and without losing our calm.
Part 3. Catherine de Medici, Subtle Politics and Quiet Tragedy. As we ease further into Catherine de Medici's world, let's pause to consider the environment she was navigating. France in the mid-16th century was a place of slow-burning tension. Religious differences, Catholic and Huguenot, were quietly, persistently tearing at the social fabric. Nobles were jockeying for position, alliances shifted like clouds, and every conversation, every letter, every gift could carry implications far beyond the immediate moment. For Catherine, this was just another day. Calm, steady, slightly weary, but always attentive. Now, many historians focus on one particularly notorious episode, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. It happened in 1572 during the marriage of her daughter, Margaret of Valois, to Henry of Navarre. On the surface, the wedding was meant to unify Catholics and Protestants, a political gesture of peace in theory. But as history tells us, things did not go exactly as planned. And yet, here's the thing. Catherine did not sit around twirling her hair, scheming maniacally with a poisoned dagger in hand. Her role was subtle, measured, and driven by political necessity. France was on edge. Religious tensions had reached a peak, and Catherine was concerned about protecting her family and her throne. Decisions were made quietly, through advisors, letters, and discreet meetings. The massacre, which claimed many lives, was part of a broader pattern of tragic outcomes that often accompanied Catherine's era, rather than a sudden act of villainy. She survived, her children survived, and her influence endured. It was the subtle orchestration of survival amid chaos, not a cartoonish poisoning spree. Let's float for a moment to her surviving children. Charles IX, deeply affected by the massacre and its aftermath, struggled with guilt, melancholy, and ill health. Catherine, as always, remained a stabilizing presence, gently guiding him while managing the court's expectations. Meanwhile, Henry III, her younger son, observed his mother's methods and absorbed lessons about patience, manipulation, and endurance. It's almost meditative to picture Catherine calmly overseeing her family and court during this period, consulting astrologers in the morning, reviewing correspondence in the afternoon, and quietly attending to her children's welfare in the evening. There's a rhythm to her life, a quiet pulse that continues despite external chaos. Meanwhile, Catherine's daughters continued to play their roles in European politics.
Elizabeth's marriage to Philip II of Spain remained politically significant, but the young queen's life was quietly constrained by etiquette, religion, and the expectations of her husband. Margaret of Valois navigated her new role with resilience and subtle wit, often enduring situations far more complicated than ordinary marriage. And Claude, the quieter daughter, managed her household with practical competence, a trait Catherine likely admired in secret. Each child was a thread in Catherine's carefully woven network, and each presented challenges that required patience, strategy, and occasional gentle coercion. Now, in the background, Catherine herself aged. By the late 1570s and 80s, her influence as Queen Mother was tempered by experience, health concerns, and the inevitable waning of absolute authority. Yet she remained a central figure, quietly advising her sons, negotiating with nobles, and maintaining the delicate balance of court life. One can imagine her in the evenings, seated in her chambers reviewing letters and reports, her mind constantly working through the slow-moving puzzle of French politics. There's a certain hypnotic quality in imagining these routines, small, deliberate, unhurried movements that shaped the destiny of a nation. Catherine also had to contend with her own legacy. The Valois dynasty was fragile, beset by illness, mortality, and political rivalries. Her children's health, their marriages, and the outcomes of her careful alliances weighed on her constantly. She lived through deaths that would have shattered less resilient mothers, yet she persisted, channeling grief into strategy. There's a subtle lesson here, almost soporific in its consistency. Life is slow, complex, and often tragic, but endurance, calculation, and quiet presence matter. And then there's the quieter side of Catherine's personality. She had tastes, preferences, and private rituals that offered small comforts in a life dominated by politics. Astrology, as mentioned before, remained a guide, but she also enjoyed art, literature, and the structure of daily routines. She cultivated gardens, oversaw the construction and decoration of palaces, and maintained a private space where she could observe, reflect, and rest. There's a soft poetry in imagining a woman of immense power walking slowly through a garden, noting the bloom of flowers, and contemplating the steady rhythm of life amid the ever-present hum of court intrigue. Religion, too, played a subtle role. Catherine was Catholic, but she navigated a kingdom divided by faith with pragmatic patience. She tried repeatedly to mediate conflicts, encourage alliances, and prevent the worst excesses of factional rivalry. It was rarely fully successful, but the effort itself is noteworthy. She was a figure of slow, deliberate diplomacy, constantly adjusting to new circumstances and quietly absorbing the shocks that might have unseated a less steady hand. By the end of her life in 1589, Catherine de Medici had survived decades of political turmoil, family tragedy, and public scrutiny. She outlived many of her children, witnessed the rise and fall of fortunes, and became a legend in her own time. Yet through it all, she maintained a calm, measured presence. Not dramatic, not overtly theatrical, just persistence, endurance, and the subtle management of chaos. Her death marked the end of an era, the quiet closing of a long chapter in French history. And yet, even in death, the stories, the rumors, and the legends continued. Catherine, the Poison Queen, remained in popular imagination. But the true story is quieter, almost hypnotic. A woman navigating impossible circumstances, quietly shaping her family and her kingdom, and enduring with subtle, relentless patience. So as we drift along tonight, we can appreciate Catherine not as a villain, not as a schemer, but as a figure of quiet resilience. There's a rhythm to her life, a slow-moving flow of political maneuvering, family care, and personal reflection that feels almost meditative. Her legacy is not loud or dramatic. It is soft, continuous, and enduring. And in that quiet endurance, we find a sort of hypnotic fascination, the perfect companion for gentle reflection as we continue our slow journey through the oddly tragic, often eccentric, and endlessly human lives of European royalty.
Part 4. The Broader Valois and European Royal Oddities. As we continue to drift through the quiet corridors of history, let's take a moment to step back from Catherine de Medici herself and consider the larger context, European royalty in the 16th and 17th centuries. Because Catherine's story, while uniquely fascinating, was part of a much broader pattern: fragile dynasties, genetically complicated offspring, and courts filled with people whose lives were equal parts duty, eccentricity, and quiet tragedy. Take the Valois dynasty, for instance. Catherine's children may have been the most immediate reflection of her careful orchestration, but the Valois line itself was notoriously delicate. Illness, early deaths, and strange physical traits were common, a combination of genetics and the pressures of inbreeding that many royal families embraced. It was, in essence, a slow-motion carousel of fragility. Children born into wealth and influence, yet often too weak to fully wield it. And Catherine, always the observant mother, was acutely aware of these patterns. She tried to mitigate them where she could, but there were limits, even for someone as patient and calculating as she was. Let's float gently over to another royal oddity, Charles II of Savoy. Not French, but a contemporary example of dynastic fragility. He suffered from various physical deformities, reportedly had a temperamental disposition, and struggled to maintain authority. In many ways, his life mirrors the quieter aspects of Catherine's children. Public responsibility weighed against private vulnerability. European aristocracy, it seems, was filled with these slow-moving tragedies, a kind of aristocratic pattern that is strangely hypnotic when considered from a distance. Then there's Henry VIII's extended lineage in England, slightly earlier but still relevant. His children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, each had their quirks and challenges. Edward, frail and sickly; Mary, prone to melancholia; Elizabeth, politically astute, but emotionally cautious. These lives, while different in national context, reflect the same themes: children shaped by dynastic necessity, surviving in courts that required both endurance and subtlety. Back to France, Catherine's grandchildren and extended relations continued this pattern. Louis XIII, later in the 17th century, inherited the Bourbon throne, a line that carefully avoided the extremes of Valois fragility, but still bore the weight of centuries of dynastic pressure. Marriages were tools of policy, children were instruments of alliances, and eccentricities were tolerated quietly, or at least publicly minimized, because the show of stability was everything. What makes Catherine's era particularly hypnotic, though, is how these patterns intersected with personal eccentricities and subtle tragedy. Imagine a child born frail, who is then married at 14 to a politically significant spouse, moved across countries, and expected to produce heirs while maintaining appearances and etiquette. It's almost meditative to consider the sheer slow-burn stress that ran through European courts day after day, decade after decade. The quiet tension, the small dramas, the patient negotiations, all of it adds up to a history that is less explosive than cinematic, yet profoundly absorbing if observed gently. And let's not forget the lighter quirks.
Many royals had odd habits, seemingly minor rituals that were amplified by their wealth and status. Some were obsessive about clothing, others about food, and some spent hours each day in contemplation or superstition. Catherine herself, with her astrology and her private rituals, fits neatly into this pattern. It's almost comforting to think of these powerful figures engaging in slow, repetitive behaviors, as if personal routine could somehow stabilize political chaos. And let's not forget the inherent fragility of Valois politics. The French court was an endless series of impatient and often subtle negotiations. Words had multiple meanings, and gestures could hold layers of context. Catherine's strategies were often played out in this shadowy, subtle arena, and her legacy lingered, shaping the actions of soldiers and courtiers long after she was gone. Now, it's worth noting that inbreeding was an unfortunate recurring theme across European royalty. Cousins married cousins, sometimes multiple generations in a row, in order to maintain control over land, titles, and influence. Valois were no exception. The consequences were subtle but persistent: frailty, strange physical traits, and sometimes emotional instability. Catherine's children were living examples of this long-standing pattern, yet she navigated it with careful observation and gentle, almost surgical intervention, steering marriages, alliances, and family strategy as delicately as one might turn the pages of a fragile manuscript. Let's linger a moment on another figure, Philip II of Spain, husband of Catherine's daughter Elizabeth. Philip was meticulous, deeply religious, and famously cautious to the point of paranoia. His life and reign were defined by a slow, deliberate approach to governance and alliances, not unlike Catherine herself. Observing these figures from afar, one notices a common thread. Power in Europe was often less about force and more about endurance, observation, and the patient handling of subtle crises. And Catherine, in her quiet, calm way, was a master of this art. Meanwhile, back in France, the Valois continued their slow decline. Each generation inherited not only the crown, but also the cumulative burden of family fragility, political expectation, and courtly intrigue. Children were trained meticulously in etiquette, diplomacy, and sometimes deception. Life was a series of measured steps, each carefully orchestrated, yet vulnerable to the randomness of health, temperament, and misfortune. And through it all, Catherine's influence lingered, a steady undercurrent, reminding her descendants that survival often required patience more than brilliance. And by the end of the 16th century, the patterns are clear. European royal life was a slow, hypnotic dance of obligation, strategy, and quiet eccentricity. Families like the Valois serve as a lens through which we can observe the rhythm of dynastic survival. Careful marriages, strategic alliances, subtle manipulations, and the patient navigation of both personal and political crises. There's a certain soothing melancholy in this continuity, a reminder that history is not always a series of explosions and battles, but sometimes a long, unhurried process of endurance, adaptation, and subtle influence. And so, as we continue tonight, we can drift among these aristocratic oddities with a gentle curiosity. Consider the quiet patience of Catherine, the frailty of her children, the careful planning of marriages, and the slow-motion tragedies that defined their lives. All of these elements create a pattern, a soft rhythm that flows from one generation to the next, weaving a hypnotic tapestry of European royal life, frail, eccentric, and endlessly absorbing in its quiet persistence.
Part 5. Royal Eccentricities and the Consequences of Dynastic Inbreeding. As we continue drifting through the quiet corridors of European history, let's focus on a recurring theme: dynastic inbreeding. It's a topic that can feel a bit grim, but when viewed slowly, analytically, and with a hint of gentle irony, it's oddly hypnotic. European royals often married within narrow circles, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, all in the name of preserving land, titles, and power. From a modern perspective, this often produced children with frailty, unusual features, or delicate health, a subtle, enduring echo of decisions made generations earlier. Take, for instance, Charles II of Spain, often called the Bewitched. He was the product of decades of intermarriage among Habsburgs. Physically, he was extremely fragile, bowed eggs, a long, narrow face, and numerous health problems. Mentally, he was slow to develop. And yet, he was king, and he had advisors who gently guided him through the slow-moving machinery of government. His life, tragically, was a testament to the consequences of dynastic obsession, but it's also a study in endurance, living slowly, delicately, under immense historical pressure. There's something almost meditative in imagining him navigating court life, surrounded by careful attendants, moving through each day with measured precision. Closer to Catherine's world, we find Henry III of France, her son, who embodied the quirks and anxieties of inbred European royalty in subtler ways. He was highly educated, aesthetically inclined, and deeply concerned with courtly appearances. He had eccentric tastes, elaborate clothing, intricate etiquette, and a preoccupation with arts and spectacle that sometimes overshadowed governance. Yet, beneath the surface, he was navigating a court full of fragile alliances, religious tension, and his own family's dynastic vulnerabilities. Watching him in slow motion, as it were, is like observing a carefully choreographed dance of caution, self-consciousness, and endurance. Even earlier, Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, a Habsburg cousin several generations removed, suffered from similar patterns. Marriages aimed at consolidating power produced children who were ill, emotionally fragile, or socially awkward. Court life in turn became a stage for subtle management of personalities, health crises, and alliances. It's a pattern that repeats across European history. Power combined with fragility, control combined with vulnerability, and the slow, hypnotic unfolding of dynastic consequences. Back in France, Catherine's influence persisted indirectly through these patterns. Her children, their marriages, and their offspring continued to interweave with other royal lines, subtly amplifying both the power and fragility of European dynasties. Her careful orchestration of alliances had long-term effects, some stabilizing, some destabilizing, all quietly shaping the continent over decades. There's a gentle rhythm here, the slow accumulation of consequences, the subtle interplay of genetics, politics, and personal quirks, all moving forward at a pace that rewards patient observation rather than dramatic attention. Of course, not all royals were ill or frail. Some exhibited eccentricity in other ways. For example, Queen Christina of Sweden in the 16th century was intensely intellectual, uninterested in traditional female roles, and famously idiosyncratic in dress and behavior. While Catherine was quietly calculating, Christina was boldly unconventional, yet both navigated similar pressures: expectations of heirs, political alliances, and the careful management of public perception. Observing these differences slowly reveals a pattern.
Eccentricity often arose in response to confinement, expectation, or a highly structured environment. Meanwhile, the Spanish Habsburgs continued the cycle of cautious, slow-moving management of fragile heirs. Kings like Philip IV and his predecessors carefully orchestrated marriages, diplomacy, and even daily routines to ensure survival and maintain influence. The resulting lives, while historically significant, often appear soporific in their rhythm. Constant observation, gentle guidance, subtle crisis management. There's a quiet fascination in imagining a royal morning, fully scheduled, every movement considered, each decision carrying long-term consequences. Back to France, we can't ignore the tragic arc of the Valois. By the end of Catherine's lifetime, the dynasty was fragile, with her children increasingly succumbing to illness or political misfortune. Her careful orchestration had slowed decline, but could not fully prevent it. It's almost hypnotic to imagine her quietly reviewing reports of court happenings, noting the health of her grandchildren, the outcomes of marriages, and the subtle shifts in noble allegiances, all without dramatic gestures, just a patient, continuous effort. And this brings us to a broader observation about European royalty. The combination of inbreeding, dynastic ambition, and human fragility created a landscape of slow-moving, understated drama. Each generation inherited both titles and vulnerabilities. Children were raised with intense expectations. Health issues were often subtle but persistent. And eccentricity, whether in habits, appearance, or personality, was normalized, quietly absorbed into the rhythm of court life. Watching it unfold historically is less like watching a sudden explosion of events and more like observing a long, gentle current shaping the course of multiple countries over decades. Even in quieter courts, the same patterns prevailed. Italy, Spain, Austria, and parts of Germany all produced royals whose lives were dominated by slow-moving crises, delicate health, and subtle social maneuvering. The fascination lies not in dramatic spectacle, but in the hypnotic consistency, careful observation, patient endurance, and the quiet management of fragile lives. Catherine de Medici, in many ways, represents the apex of this style of survival. Not the most dramatic, not the loudest, but perhaps the most patient and deliberate orchestrator of events in European history. So, as we drift gently forward tonight, consider these patterns. Children born into privilege, yet vulnerable. Marriages arranged for stability, yet carrying hidden consequences. Eccentricities that emerge in response to confinement, expectation, and the subtle, patient management required to navigate these complex lives. There's a rhythm to all of this, a slow, soporific pulse that guides European history quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet with enormous long-term influence.
Part 6. Fragile Monarchs and Gentle Courtly Oddities. As we continue floating through European royal history, let's turn our attention to some particularly delicate or emotionally complex monarchs. These are the rulers whose lives were defined less by dramatic conquest and more by quiet fragility, eccentric habits, and subtle dynastic pressures. It's fascinating, almost hypnotic, to consider how much of history unfolded through small gestures, gentle observations, and carefully managed appearances. Take, for example, Edward VI of England, the son of Henry VIII. He became king at just 9 years old, inheriting a realm in which religion, politics, and dynastic pressures collided endlessly. Edward was intelligent, thoughtful, and remarkably pious for his age, yet frail and chronically ill.
His court was a delicate balance of advisors, religious factions, and nobles quietly maneuvering for influence. Edward's reign was short, and while his decisions mattered, the quiet rhythm of court life, letters, consultations, ceremonial appearances defined much of his experience. There's something strangely calming in imagining the child king moving slowly through these responsibilities, aware of weighty expectations, yet limited by the fragility of youth. Meanwhile, in France, Charles IX, Catherine de Medici's son, exhibited a mix of melancholy and indecision. He inherited both the crown and the complex religious tensions that had simmered throughout his mother's life. Illness and anxiety shadowed him, and court observers frequently commented on his nervous temperament. Yet Catherine's patient guidance provided a steady undercurrent, allowing Charles to navigate the stormy waters of late 16th century France without the dramatics one might expect. His life was defined by slow adaptation, subtle influence, and the quiet endurance of both personal and political challenges. In Spain, Philip III provides another example of monarchic delicacy. He was largely uninterested in the day-to-day affairs of governance, delegating power to favorites while maintaining the appearance of authority. His cautious nature and avoidance of direct conflict created a slow-moving court where intrigue and management replaced battle and conquest. Observing Philip III in the rhythm of his court, ceremonies, audiences, and carefully staged appearances offers a sense of hypnotic order, the kind of steady cadence that defines much of European dynastic life. Even in smaller courts, these patterns persist. Consider Christian IV of Denmark, a king with a flair for the arts, elaborate public appearances, and careful management of his personal image. While outwardly vibrant and theatrical, Christian IV was also methodical, aware of the fragility of life and the delicate balances required in courtly politics. There's a quiet charm in imagining his slow, deliberate routines, morning prayers, inspections of palace grounds, consultations with advisors, and the subtle, continuous shaping of dynastic strategy. Returning to France, the younger members of the Valois dynasty faced similar pressures. Margaret of Valois, for example, had to navigate a foreign husband, religious tension, and constant courtly expectations. Her personal resilience was tested daily, and yet she endured. Catherine's guidance, subtle and persistent, shaped her ability to manage these pressures. It's calming, in a slightly melancholy way, to imagine the mother-daughter conversations, measured advice, gentle encouragement, and quiet reminders of the slow, patient approach required to survive aristocratic life. Emotional fragility was often paired with eccentricity. Monarchs like Anne of Austria, mother of Louis XIV, exhibited deep introspection and devotion to ritual. Her personal habits, long walks, extended prayers, careful observation of court etiquette, created a rhythm that balanced the chaos of courtly life. These behaviors, while seeming minor, had the effect of structuring her days and influencing those around her. There's something soothing in the thought of her moving slowly, deliberately, shaping her own environment and subtly guiding the next generation. Even in cases where health problems were pronounced, the same calm, deliberate patterns emerge. For example, Louis II of Spain, the Habsburg king often noted for extreme frailty and physical deformity, experienced a life in which small daily routines, gentle supervision, and patient adaptation defined his existence. It's tempting to imagine these monarchs quietly moving through palaces, engaging in minimal public appearances, and allowing advisors to manage the larger crises while maintaining a measured presence. And yet, within all of this quiet fragility, there's a persistent pattern: endurance. These monarchs, frail or eccentric as they were, navigated lives of immense pressure with subtlety. Personal oddities, emotional sensitivity, and physical frailty did not prevent them from participating in the slow, hypnotic rhythm of dynastic life. Each ritual, each ceremony, each carefully chosen word contributed to a web of stability and influence, even amid the fragility that defined their lives. Returning briefly to Catherine de Medici, we can see her influence echoed across these generations. Her approach, patient, careful, subtly manipulative when needed, was replicated in smaller courts, among children, and in the management of alliances across Europe. Her life illustrates the slow, continuous pulse of survival amid fragility, a gentle, almost meditative navigation of complex human networks, where quiet observation mattered as much as action. So as we drift along tonight, consider the hypnotic consistency of European royal life. Frail children raised with intense expectations, marriages arranged to preserve influence, eccentric habits tolerated or cultivated, and careful management guiding the slow evolution of dynasties. It is a rhythm of endurance, observation, and gentle adaptation, a pattern that continues through Catherine's story and beyond, forming a quiet, absorbing tapestry of aristocratic existence. There is no rush here, no sudden upheaval. The fascination lies in the slow unfolding, the subtle patterns, and the gentle persistence of human life, even in the rarefied world of European royalty. Fragility, eccentricity, and careful management coexist in a soothing cadence, a meditative reflection on the quiet endurance of those born to inherit crowns, responsibilities, and centuries of expectation.
Part 7. Quirky Habits and Dynastic Misfortune. As we continue our slow journey through European royalty, let's turn our attention to the small, unusual habits that often defined these lives. Habits that, in combination with fragility or inbreeding, created a uniquely hypnotic tapestry of aristocratic existence. These are the quirks that historians note almost casually, yet they offer insight into the rhythms, pressures, and subtle tragedies of royal life. Consider Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, a man of immense power yet notorious for eccentricities. He spent long hours in contemplation, surrounded by alchemists, astrologers, and strange curiosities. He was deeply interested in art, science, and the mystical, often to the exclusion of governance. Imagine a man of authority, quietly absorbed in celestial charts or bizarre experiments, while his empire moves at a slower, calculated pace around him. There's something soothing, almost soporific, in visualizing a ruler whose mind drifts gently among curiosities, yet whose influence is felt subtly, indirectly. Back in France, Catherine de Medici's grandchildren often inherited not only titles, but also quirks. Her son Henry III, for instance, maintained elaborate rituals of dress and etiquette, often spending hours preparing for audiences. Some contemporaries considered him fussy or vain. Others quietly noted his delicate awareness of appearance as a tool to maintain authority and manage perception. There's a hypnotic quality in observing these small acts, meticulous attention, deliberate pacing, and the constant balancing of personal inclination with dynastic expectation. Even minor habits could have long-lasting consequences. Louis XIV, later known as the Sun King, would famously rise at precise hours, conduct detailed routines, and orchestrate his court around strict schedules. While he appears dramatically extravagant to modern eyes, his life was defined by slow, deliberate management of both people and perception, a quiet echo of patterns seen in Catherine's generation. Small gestures, repeated daily, created the framework within which enormous power could function. Then there are the quieter, more tragic stories.
Some royal children, born frail or sickly, spent lives carefully shielded from public view. They moved slowly through palaces, observed by attendants, physicians, and family, their routines carefully structured to preserve health and composure. Catherine's own children, particularly those who survived into adolescence, often lived under this quiet surveillance. There's a subtle, meditative drama in imagining these lives: slow mornings, measured activities, quiet reflections, punctuated by gentle instruction from caretakers or parents. And let's not forget the unfortunate consequences of dynastic choices. Inbreeding across generations created a pattern of fragility and vulnerability. Strange physical traits, recurring illnesses, and limited reproductive potential were common. Yet within this pattern, families like the Valois, Habsburgs, and Bourbons found ways to maintain influence. Small adjustments, careful marriages, and patient endurance became their tools, creating a slow, hypnotic rhythm in which survival, rather than conquest, dominated daily existence. Eccentricity often emerged as a response to these pressures. Some monarchs immersed themselves in art, architecture, or science. Others devoted themselves to ritual, fashion, or religious observance. Peter the Great of Russia, for instance, would later become famous for reforms, yet his early life included obsessive attention to personal routines and detailed observation of customs. These behaviors, seemingly minor, shaped the slow, deliberate unfolding of his eventual influence. Returning to France, Catherine's legacy is visible in the behaviors of her surviving children and grandchildren. Her guidance, subtle as it was, created a framework for endurance, observation, and cautious manipulation of circumstance. Even as the Valois line eventually waned, the principles of patient management, careful orchestration, and slow adaptation persisted in European royal households. There is almost a meditative quality to observing these patterns, a slow pulse of life that emphasizes continuity, adaptation, and subtle influence over dramatic spectacle. Even tragic moments, such as the death of a child, the frailty of a young king, or the failure of an alliance, fit into this rhythm. Loss, grief, and misfortune were absorbed, processed, and quietly acted upon. There's a gentle, hypnotic cadence in imagining how these events were integrated into daily life. Measured responses, quiet reflection, subtle adjustment, all forming part of the ongoing narrative of survival and influence. So as we float further through this tapestry of European royal life, we begin to see a consistent pattern: fragility, eccentricity, subtle management, and the quiet endurance of dynastic lines. The hypnotic element comes not from dramatic events, but from observing the slow, deliberate, and continuous unfolding of human behavior under extreme expectations. There is comfort, in a slightly melancholy way, in watching these lives unfold, knowing that persistence, careful observation, and small, repeated actions often mattered more than dramatic gestures. And with that, we can begin to gently transition to the final reflections on Catherine's influence, the lasting effects of dynastic inbreeding, and the quirky, fragile patterns that defined European royalty for generations. These lessons of patience, subtlety, and quiet endurance form the final notes of our hypnotic journey through aristocratic history tonight.
Part 8. Reflections on Catherine's legacy and the quiet patterns of royal life. As we float toward the quieter edges of this historical exploration, it's worth taking a slow, contemplative look at Catherine de Medici herself. She has often been remembered as the Poison Queen, a title that evokes images of intrigue, secret vials, and dramatic betrayals. Yet, as we've observed tonight, her life was far more subtle, patient, and hypnotically deliberate. The true story lies not in sudden acts of villainy, but in decades of quiet management, careful orchestration of her children's futures, and the gentle navigation of courts filled with fragile, eccentric, and often unpredictable individuals. Catherine's legacy is most evident in the slow-moving ripple effects of her guidance. Her children, while imperfect, survived the pressures of courtly life, navigated alliances, and, in some cases, extended the influence of France across Europe. Even as tragedy and fragility shadowed her family, Catherine's patient approach ensured that the dynasty endured longer than it might have under less attentive stewardship. It's calming to imagine her in her chambers at night, reviewing letters, considering marriages, observing the ebb and flow of courtly politics, all with deliberate calm and almost meditative focus. Her influence also extended beyond her immediate family. Through marriages, alliances, and careful observation of European courts, Catherine left traces of her approach in other dynasties. There's a certain hypnotic pattern to note here. Rulers across Europe adopted subtle, patient management techniques, sometimes echoing her methods unconsciously. Quiet observation, careful orchestration of appearances, and a gentle, persistent handling of crises became tools of survival in a world where dramatic upheaval was always possible, but not inevitable. It's also worth reflecting on the personal side of Catherine's story. She endured the deaths of children, the frailty of heirs, and the slow erosion of dynastic stability with remarkable calm. Her life was punctuated not by dramatic spectacle, but by a steady rhythm of adaptation, grief absorbed quietly, and strategic choices made with patience. There's a hypnotic quality in observing this rhythm. Each decision, each action, each quiet adjustment contributes to a larger pattern of survival, influence, and endurance. And as we broaden our lens, the patterns we see in Catherine's life resonate across European royal history. Fragility, eccentricity, subtle management, and quiet endurance recur across dynasties. Inbreeding produced delicate children. Marriages created webs of obligation and alliance. Rulers developed eccentric habits, obsessive routines, and slow-moving rituals to manage the pressures of aristocratic life. The fascination here is not in explosive drama, but in observing the hypnotic flow of these patterns across generations. Small, deliberate actions shaping enormous historical consequences, quietly and persistently. Even the seemingly minor quirks of monarchs, meticulous dress, obsessive attention to daily routines, preference for art or astrology, contributed to the steady rhythm of court life. These habits offered structure, comfort, and a gentle form of control in worlds where unpredictability was always lurking. Observing them slowly, as we have tonight, offers a kind of quiet meditation on the nature of power, fragility, and endurance. Catherine's story also reminds us that history is often less about sudden, dramatic events and more about patient observation, slow adaptation, and gentle orchestration of events. Her life demonstrates that influence can be subtle, resilience can be quiet, and the impact of careful, deliberate choices can ripple across generations in ways that are hypnotically absorbing when viewed with calm attention. And by the end of her life, Catherine had witnessed decades of political tension, personal tragedy, and dynastic uncertainty. And yet she remained a figure of patient endurance, quietly shaping her family, her court, and, in subtle ways, the broader European stage. There's a gentle poetry in this observation. Her legacy is not explosive, not overtly theatrical, but continuous, deliberate, and quietly pervasive. So as we gently close our exploration tonight, we can drift with a sense of calm reflection. Catherine de Medici, her children, and the broader European aristocracy reveal a hypnotic pattern of life, fragile yet enduring, eccentric yet structured, tragic yet quietly beautiful in its rhythm. The slow, deliberate pacing of courtly life, the subtle orchestration of events, and the patient endurance of human fragility form a tapestry that is endlessly absorbing when approached with quiet attention. And with that, we can settle into the final, soporific understanding. European history, particularly the lives of royalty, is not always about grand battles or dramatic betrayals. Often it's about the gentle unfolding of daily routines, the careful management of fragile lives, and the subtle persistence of influence across decades. It's a soft, continuous rhythm, a quiet current of human endeavor that we can observe, reflect upon, and perhaps drift gently to sleep with. So tonight, as the lights dim and the world quiets, we can leave Catherine de Medici and her world behind, not with shock, not with alarm, but with a sense of calm fascination. Her life, her legacy, and the hypnotic patterns of European royalty offer a soothing reminder of the slow, persistent, and quietly enduring nature of human history.
Part 9. Shadows of Fragility and the Gentle Echoes of Royal Oddities. As we continue drifting through the quiet corridors of European history, it's worth pausing to consider the lingering shadows of fragility in royal households. By now we've seen the slow rhythm of Catherine de Medici's life, her children's struggles, and the subtle consequences of dynastic inbreeding. But there are still more lives to observe, monarchs and heirs whose quirks, illnesses, and eccentric habits offer a hypnotic window into aristocratic existence. Take, for example, Queen Christina of Sweden, who we touched on earlier. She was deeply intellectual, fiercely independent, and uninterested in the usual expectations of female monarchy. Christina spent long hours in study, collected vast libraries, and corresponded with philosophers across Europe. To some courtiers, her behavior was unconventional, even baffling. To us, it's almost meditative, a monarch moving slowly through her world, guided by curiosity and introspection, rather than political expediency alone. Her court became a sanctuary of ideas, a quiet haven of deliberate thought and measured action. In Spain, we have Philip IV, whose reign was marked by careful observation and subtle orchestration. Though outwardly capable, he relied heavily on favorites and advisors, creating a court where small, precise decisions rippled slowly across governance. There's a hypnotic rhythm here: ceremonies, letters, audiences, all contributing to a steady, unhurried flow of authority. Even minor quirks, meticulous dress, obsessive review of documents, slow-paced social interactions, shaped the perception and execution of power. Back in France, Catherine's surviving grandchildren continued to navigate the delicate legacy of dynastic expectation. Henry IV of France, though later renowned for his pragmatic policies, also inherited a court environment infused with subtle anxieties, fragile heirs, and careful observation. The lessons of endurance, subtle manipulation, and patient orchestration, first exemplified by Catherine, echoed through his life and decisions. There's a quiet fascination in seeing patterns repeat across generations, a slow-motion continuity that becomes almost hypnotic when observed closely. And let's not forget the minor, quieter figures who shaped these courts through subtle presence. Ladies-in-waiting, advisors, tutors, and physicians moved carefully, guided by protocol, habit, and gentle observation. Their actions were often unnoticed by history at large, yet they maintained the rhythm of aristocratic life. Imagine the measured pacing of their days, preparing rooms, attending audiences, delivering letters, or observing courtly rituals. These small, repetitive actions, integrated over decades, created a pattern of stability in fragile households. Dynastic inbreeding continued to leave its subtle mark. Traits, frailty, and vulnerabilities were transmitted slowly, imperceptibly at first, then more evidently in successive generations. Habsburgs, Valois, and Bourbons all exemplified this pattern. Their children's development, health, and temperament reflected centuries of careful, patient strategy, yet the results were often delicate, eccentric, or unpredictable. Watching these threads weave across Europe is hypnotically absorbing, a steady current of cause and effect, spanning decades, quietly shaping history. Meanwhile, minor eccentricities persisted alongside frailty. Some monarchs were obsessed with cleanliness, others with astrology, and still others with art or architecture. Peter the Great's early attention to routines, for instance, or Louis XIV's ceremonial pacing, or Charles II of Spain's fascination with curiosities, all fit into this same hypnotic framework. These habits, repeated gently over decades, structured court life and subtly influenced the world beyond the palace walls. Even tragedy moved slowly. Children's illnesses, early deaths, and frailty punctuated the rhythm of aristocratic life. Catherine herself witnessed these patterns, guiding her children with a quiet hand, adapting routines, and subtly shaping alliances. There's a hypnotic fascination in imagining her small adjustments, a letter here, a gentle suggestion there, a carefully timed decision to preserve health or influence. Each act, no matter how minor, contributed to the larger, slow-moving tapestry of dynastic survival. And so, as we continue our gentle reflection tonight, consider this. European royal history is less about explosive events and more about the persistent unfolding of patterns. Fragility, eccentricity, subtle management, and quiet endurance create a hypnotic cadence that defines aristocratic existence. From Catherine de Medici to her descendants and contemporaries across Europe, we see a rhythm of life that is calm, deliberate, and endlessly absorbing when observed slowly. The fascination lies not in drama, but in continuity. Small habits, patient orchestration, and quiet adaptation ripple across generations. Children are raised with intense expectations. Marriages are arranged with subtle strategy. Eccentricities and frailty are integrated into daily life.
This slow, persistent unfolding of human behavior forms the soft, continuous rhythm of European aristocracy, a rhythm that remains mesmerizing even centuries later. And as we drift toward the final layers of tonight's historical exploration, we can settle into the quiet realization that the stories of Catherine, her children, and the broader European nobility are not just tales of fragility or eccentricity. They are gentle studies of endurance, adaptation, and the hypnotic patterns of life shaped by centuries of careful observation, subtle influence, and patient survival.
Part 10. The Quiet Legacy of Catherine de Medici and the Hypnotic Rhythm of Royal Life. As we slowly settle into the final reflections of tonight's journey, it's calming to pause and take stock of the patterns we've observed across centuries of European aristocracy. Catherine de Medici, often remembered in legends as the Poison Queen, was in reality a figure of quiet endurance, subtle orchestration, and patient influence. Her life and the lives of her children and descendants illustrate a hypnotic rhythm that defined the courts of Europe: slow, deliberate, and quietly absorbing. Catherine's approach to life was almost meditative in its steadiness. She balanced grief with strategy, fragility with patience, and eccentricity with practical necessity. Her children, shaped by both genetics and circumstance, inherited these rhythms, learning the gentle art of endurance and careful observation. Even the tragedies that befell them, the illnesses, the frailty, the pressures of dynastic expectation, were absorbed into the quiet cadence of daily life. Looking beyond France, we see echoes of her influence in the slow, deliberate habits of other European monarchs. In Spain, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, rulers moved carefully through ceremonial routines, carefully structured days, and subtle courtly maneuvers. Eccentricities, obsessive attention to ritual, clothing, diet, or astrology, were woven into daily life, providing both comfort and structure. Fragility, both physical and emotional, persisted across generations, yet influence continued through patience and subtle management. And then there is the hypnotic beauty of repetition. Daily routines, repeated habits, and small gestures quietly shaped history. A child carefully guided through courtly expectations, a marriage negotiated with quiet strategy, a minor ritual observed for decades. All of these acts ripple slowly, imperceptibly across generations. Catherine's own life exemplifies this rhythm. Letters reviewed in the evening, consultations with advisors, observation of children and grandchildren, all small acts, yet collectively monumental in their enduring effect. We've also observed the gentle interplay of fragility and eccentricity. Charles IX, Henry III, Edward VI, and countless others exhibited delicate health, emotional sensitivity, or idiosyncratic behaviors. These traits, rather than diminishing their historical importance, added texture to the hypnotic tapestry of aristocratic life. They remind us that influence is not always loud, decisions are not always dramatic, and survival often depends on endurance rather than spectacle. The slow, deliberate patterns of European dynastic life offer a strange comfort when observed with patience. Courtly intrigue, marriages arranged for strategy, careful observation of heirs, and eccentric habits, all of these elements combine to form a gentle, continuous rhythm. It is a rhythm that persists, unnoticed by most contemporaries, yet with consequences that echo across centuries. Returning to Catherine, her legacy is not in scandal or sensationalism, but in subtle influence and patient orchestration. She navigated decades of political tension, religious conflict, and personal tragedy with remarkable composure. Her children, though fragile, survived longer than might have been expected.
Her careful observation and management of court life left traces in the behaviors of subsequent monarchs. The hypnotic continuity of her methods is almost meditative. Small, deliberate actions adding up over time to create enduring influence. And so, as we slowly drift to the close of tonight's journey, it's comforting to reflect on the quiet, persistent patterns we've traced. European royalty, fragile and eccentric though it was, followed rhythms of observation, endurance, and subtle management. Catherine de Medici, her children, and countless other monarchs participated in this slow, hypnotic flow, leaving a tapestry of human experience that is oddly mesmerizing in its continuity. In the soft glow of reflection, we can appreciate the gentle persistence of these lives, the quiet orchestration of dynastic strategy, the subtle management of fragile heirs, and the slow unfolding of quirks and eccentricities. There is no need for dramatic conclusions or explosive revelations. The fascination lies in the rhythm itself, the hypnotic pulse of endurance, adaptation, and subtle influence that shapes history as surely as any battle or conquest. And with that, we can rest, letting the story of Catherine de Medici, her children, and the broader patterns of European aristocracy fade slowly into the calm of memory. The courtly intrigues, quiet tragedies, and patient endurance are part of a continuum, soft, deliberate, and endlessly absorbing. As the lights dim and the day winds down, we leave behind the bustling world of palaces, fragile heirs, and eccentric monarchs, carrying with us a gentle understanding of the hypnotic rhythm of history, shaped by patience, subtlety, and quiet endurance.
Part 11. Gentle Whispers of Courtly Life and the Lesser-Known Royals. Even after centuries, European courts had their quieter residents, those who never made dramatic history books but nonetheless shaped the hypnotic rhythm of aristocratic life. Courtiers, minor princes, and obscure queens often moved through life with delicate grace, eccentricity, or quiet vulnerability. Observing them slowly, we begin to see the intricate lattice of behavior, habit, and subtle influence that underpinned even the most powerful dynasties. Consider Queen Anne of Austria, mother of Louis XIV. Her life was largely defined by patient endurance, managing her role in a regency, raising heirs in a fragile dynastic environment, and quietly shaping courtly behavior. She practiced careful observation, long walks in reflection, and measured interactions with ministers and advisors. Her personal habits, slow, deliberate, and repetitive, echoed the subtle patterns Catherine had modeled a generation earlier. Watching her move through the palace, one imagines a rhythm of life that is calming, almost soporific in its quiet repetition. Then there were minor princes and princesses, often living in relative obscurity, whose delicate health or unusual habits required gentle care. Some were frail from birth, others eccentric in temperament. Their days were structured around observation, routine, and subtle management. Meals, attire, correspondence, and small ceremonies all contributed to a slow, continuous rhythm that shaped courtly life. Even in their apparent insignificance, these individuals contributed to the hypnotic continuity of dynastic Europe. Take Prince Rupert of the Rhine, cousin of the English royal line. Though he would later gain military renown, his early years were full of careful instruction, observation, and slow adaptation to the expectations of aristocratic life. His eccentricities, fondness for science, animals, and artistic pursuits, were cultivated in a courtly environment that prized patience and subtlety. Even his energetic tendencies were tempered by the hypnotic rhythm of carefully scheduled routines. And in France, lesser-known Valois relatives moved quietly through lives filled with delicate expectation.
The court's daily rhythm, audiences, ceremonial meals, religious observances, and careful supervision of heirs perpetuated the same hypnotic cadence we have observed in Catherine's more prominent children. Each small gesture, repeated endlessly, contributed to continuity, stability, and subtle influence, even in the face of fragility. Dynastic inbreeding continued to echo gently through generations. Physical fragility, unusual features, and predispositions to illness were quietly absorbed into daily life. Courtiers and physicians monitored routines carefully, and small adjustments were made with steady hands. There is something mesmerizing in imagining these measured interventions, a slow, methodical dance of caretaking and influence, often unnoticed by history, yet critical to the survival of aristocratic lines. Even eccentricity found its rhythm. Some royals developed elaborate rituals around meals, clothing, or daily schedules. Others collected curiosities, studied astrology, or obsessed over minor architectural details. Each behavior, repeated gently over years, structured the court and subtly shaped perception and influence. Observing these habits from a distance offers a hypnotic meditation on the slow, persistent shaping of aristocratic life. Catherine de Medici's indirect influence persisted in these minor figures as well. Her model of careful observation, patient orchestration, and measured endurance became an unspoken guide for subsequent generations. Courtiers learned, often unconsciously, to navigate fragility, eccentricity, and the subtle pressures of court life. There's a quiet poetry in this continuity. Repeated habits, slow adaptation, and gentle endurance echo across generations, forming a tapestry of aristocratic existence that is soothing in its rhythm. As we reflect tonight, it is worth noting that even minor tragedies, the early death of a child, the frailty of an heir, or the subtle failure of a political alliance, fit into this hypnotic cadence. Loss was absorbed, processed, and quietly acted upon, maintaining the overall rhythm of survival. Each small adjustment rippled slowly, shaping the future of families, courts, and dynasties. In essence, European royal history, when observed patiently, reveals a calm, continuous pulse. Fragility, eccentricity, subtle management, and quiet endurance combine to create a mesmerizing pattern. Catherine de Medici, her children, and the broader web of aristocracy exemplify this hypnotic rhythm. Delicate lives moving deliberately, habits and routines persisting across decades, and influence exerted subtly rather than dramatically. And so, as we drift further into the shadows of history tonight, we can settle into this gentle reflection. The lives of lesser-known royals, minor courtiers, and fragile heirs are not insignificant. They contribute to the hypnotic continuity of dynastic life. Their slow, deliberate actions, eccentric habits, and quiet endurance form the undercurrent of European history, a rhythm that is endlessly absorbing when observed with patience and attention.
Part 12. The persistent rhythm of fragile dynasties. As we continue our quiet exploration, it becomes clear that European royal history is not defined solely by wars, coronations, or dramatic scandals. Instead, it often unfolds as a gentle, hypnotic rhythm of small actions, repeated habits, and subtle management. Catherine de Medici exemplified this pattern. Her life, her guidance of her children, and her careful orchestration of dynastic alliances created ripples that persisted for decades. Observing this slowly, we begin to appreciate the delicate, almost meditative cadence of aristocratic existence. Even minor courtiers and distant relatives contributed to this rhythm. Their days were filled with measured routines, delivering letters, observing etiquette,
assisting fragile children, or arranging small ceremonial details. These actions, though quiet and unremarkable in isolation, collectively maintained the stability of households, shaped perceptions, and ensured that dynastic lines endured. There is a hypnotic quality in imagining these lives. Each movement deliberate, each habit repeated, each interaction a subtle note in a grand, continuous composition. Fragility remained a constant companion in aristocratic life. Generations of inbreeding, combined with the pressures of high expectation, produced children and adults prone to illness, emotional sensitivity, or eccentric behavior. Yet these traits were absorbed into daily routines, accommodated with patience, and subtly managed to preserve influence. Charles II of Spain, Edward VI of England, and countless lesser-known heirs demonstrate how fragility shaped not only individuals, but also the slow, deliberate rhythm of court life. Their lives remind us that survival, rather than spectacle, often dominated the aristocratic experience. Eccentricity also contributed to this hypnotic tapestry. Monarchs obsessed with fashion, ritual, astrology, or art created patterns of behavior that structured the court and subtly guided influence. Louis XIV's ceremonial routines, Rudolph II's fascination with curiosities, and Peter the Great's meticulous attention to detail all exemplify the gentle persistence of eccentric habits. These behaviors, repeated slowly over years, added texture and rhythm to aristocratic life, reinforcing the hypnotic continuity we've observed throughout this journey. Even tragedy fit into the cadence. The deaths of children, the frailty of heirs, and the failure of alliances were absorbed gradually, processed with care, and integrated into daily routines. Catherine herself witnessed these slow-moving sorrows, guiding her children with patience, adjusting strategies, and quietly shaping courtly life. The hypnotic element lies in the measured response, grief tempered with observation, loss absorbed into a continuum, and decisions made with deliberation rather than haste. Looking back across centuries, patterns emerge. Dynastic ambition, fragility, eccentricity, and subtle orchestration create a quiet, continuous pulse that defines European aristocracy. Catherine de Medici's life is central to this pattern. Her patient endurance, careful guidance, and quiet influence left a legacy not of spectacle, but of subtle, persistent shaping of history. Her methods, observation, adjustment, and gentle orchestration echoed in the habits of later monarchs, minor courtiers, and fragile heirs alike. There is something almost soporific in observing this continuity. Each generation repeats similar rhythms, minor habits reinforced, eccentricities absorbed, fragile lives guided with patience. The fascination is not in dramatic events, but in the hypnotic flow, small gestures accumulating over decades to shape dynasties, influence governments, and preserve fragile legacies. And as we drift toward the conclusion of tonight's exploration, we can settle into this reflection. European royalty, with all its fragility and eccentricity, offers a study in patience, endurance, and subtle influence. Catherine de Medici and her descendants exemplify this rhythm, quiet, deliberate, and hypnotically persistent. The courtly world, with its measured routines, eccentric habits, and delicate airs, forms a tapestry of human life that is absorbing precisely because it unfolds slowly, gently, and without dramatic urgency. And finally, in the soft, quiet glow of reflection, we can appreciate the hypnotic beauty of these lives. Catherine de Medici, her children, and the broader European aristocracy remind us that history often moves in subtle waves. It is not only the loud and spectacular events that define the past, but the patient endurance, delicate management, and repeated routines of those who lived slowly and carefully, day after day. There is a quiet comfort in this understanding, a calm, gentle rhythm that soothes the mind and invites the listener to drift along, much like the gentle currents of history itself.
Part 13. Minor courtiers, forgotten royals, and the gentle flow of history. Even after centuries, there are countless minor figures in European royal history whose lives, though rarely celebrated, contribute to the hypnotic rhythm we've been tracing. These are the courtiers, distant cousins, overlooked heirs, and fragile children whose daily routines, subtle habits, and gentle eccentricities maintained the flow of dynastic life. They are the quiet currents beneath the more visible waves of power, yet their presence is essential to understanding the gentle, continuous pulse of aristocracy. Take, for example, the numerous younger children of the Valois, Habsburg, and Bourbon families. Many lived largely behind the scenes, observed by attendants and physicians, carefully shielded from the strains of courtly life. Their days were filled with slow-moving routines, study, prayer, measured play, and observation of adult ceremonies. While their contributions to major historical events may be minor, their existence helped maintain the subtle rhythm of aristocratic households. There is a soporific fascination in imagining their lives unfolding gently, day after day, in slow repetition. Even courtiers played a role in this hypnotic rhythm. Tutors instructed fragile heirs, chambermaids attended to meticulous routines, and advisors advised discreetly. Their actions, though small, reinforced the continuous flow of dynastic life. Imagine a court where every gesture, letter, and ceremony follows a measured pace. A careful choreography of human behavior, quietly shaping perception and influence. It is in these small, repetitive motions that the hypnotic continuity of royal life emerges. Dynastic fragility continued to echo across generations. Inbreeding, delicate health, and predispositions to illness were quietly managed by attentive households. Minor adjustments, a careful diet here, a gentle restriction of activity there, a subtle observation of mood and temperament, formed part of the slow, almost meditative routine of aristocratic life. These measures, repeated over decades, preserved fragile heirs and ensured the persistence of dynasties despite physical or emotional vulnerability. Eccentricity, too, contributes to this hypnotic rhythm. Monarchs obsessed with ceremonial detail, fashion, astrology, or curiosities infused daily life with subtle structure. Rudolph II's fascination with art and alchemy, Peter the Great's meticulous routines, and Louis XIV's ceremonial pacing all illustrate how repeated eccentricity structure shapes perception and contributes to continuity. The fascination is not in spectacle, but in the gentle, persistent unfolding of these behaviors over years. Catherine de Medici's influence, direct and indirect, is visible in these patterns. Her patient guidance, subtle orchestration, and enduring strategies were echoed in the behaviors of her children, courtiers, and even minor royals across Europe. There is a hypnotic beauty in this continuity. Patterns of endurance, careful observation, and repeated habits flowing quietly across generations, shaping history in ways that are almost imperceptible but endlessly absorbing.
Even small tragedies such as the death of a child, frailty of an heir, or minor political setback fit into this rhythm. These events were absorbed, quietly mourned, and integrated into daily routines. The continuity of life persisted, and minor adjustments were made with patience and care. Observing this slow, deliberate adaptation offers a meditative perspective on the nature of power, fragility, and survival. Ultimately, the hypnotic pattern of European aristocracy is characterized by three intertwined elements: fragility, eccentricity, and subtle management. Catherine de Medici, her children, and countless lesser-known figures exemplify this pattern. Daily life, repeated habits, minor adjustments, and patient observation combine to create a soft, continuous pulse, a rhythm that persists quietly across centuries, shaping dynasties and human lives alike. As we drift further into reflection tonight, we can appreciate the calm continuity of these lives. History is often imagined as dramatic, fast-moving, and filled with spectacle. Yet the truth, when observed patiently, is more soporific. Fragile heirs guided gently, eccentric monarchs moving deliberately, courtiers maintaining subtle order, and generations quietly repeating the patterns of endurance, observation, and adaptation. And so, even in the quietest corners of European history, the minor princes, courtiers, and overlooked heirs, we can see the hypnotic pulse of aristocratic life. Their daily routines, repeated habits, and subtle adjustments collectively maintain the rhythm of dynastic continuity, providing a gentle, immersive experience for those willing to observe slowly and patiently.
Part 14. The subtle continuity of dynasties and quiet endurance. As we continue drifting through the slow-moving currents of European history, it's calming to consider how dynasties persisted not through dramatic battles or loud triumphs, but through the quiet endurance of countless small actions. Catherine de Medici exemplifies this principle. Her patient orchestration of her children's lives, careful guidance of alliances, and gentle management of courtly pressures created ripples that extended far beyond her lifetime. Watching these patterns unfold is hypnotically absorbing, like observing a river carve its path slowly, imperceptibly over centuries. Even the smallest courtiers and peripheral figures contributed to this rhythm. Tutors, physicians, chambermaids, and minor nobles moved through the day with careful attention to routine, ensuring fragile heirs were observed, ceremonial details were maintained, and the intricate web of courtly expectations continued uninterrupted. Their repeated actions, seemingly trivial, formed the structural underpinning of dynastic continuity. There is a soothing fascination in imagining these lives, slow, deliberate, and almost meditative, yet essential to the smooth functioning of aristocracy. Fragility, of course, remained a defining feature. Generations of inbreeding, delicate health, and emotional sensitivity required careful adaptation. Minor adjustments, a slightly modified diet, a gentle restriction on activity, or the timing of an audience were implemented with patience and attention. The cumulative effect of these small, repeated interventions was profound, ensuring survival and continuity. Observing these slow, methodical practices provides a hypnotic sense of order amid the seeming chaos of historical events. Eccentricity also played a critical role in maintaining rhythm. Monarchs obsessed with fashion, ritual, astrology, or curiosities created structures that reinforced courtly order.
Rudolph II's fascination with alchemy, Louis XIV's ceremonial routines, and Peter the Great's meticulous habits all illustrate how eccentric behavior can be integrated into daily life, shaping perception and maintaining continuity. Each repeated habit, carefully observed and maintained, contributed to the soft, continuous pulse of aristocratic life. Catherine's influence echoes through these behaviors. Her subtle orchestration, patience, and careful observation set a template for managing fragility, eccentricity, and dynastic responsibility. Her children, her courtiers, and even the minor figures of European courts internalized aspects of her approach. There is a hypnotic beauty in observing how these methods were passed down, patterns of endurance, observation, and quiet adaptation repeated across generations, shaping history with gentle persistence. Even small tragedies, the death of a child, the illness of an heir, or a failed alliance, fit into this rhythm. Loss was absorbed gradually, quietly mourned, and woven into daily routines. Adjustments were made with care, and life continued, preserving the continuity of dynasties. The fascination lies not in drama, but in the gentle, deliberate unfolding of events over time. It is a soft, hypnotic cadence, soothing in its predictability and subtlety. Across centuries, this rhythm repeats. Fragile heirs, eccentric monarchs, minor courtiers, and attentive advisors collectively form a tapestry of continuous action. Daily routines, repeated habits, and subtle interventions sustain dynasties, influence politics, and shape perceptions. Catherine de Medici, her children, minor royals, and countless courtiers collectively maintained a quiet, enduring rhythm, a soft pulse that continues to fascinate and soothe the imagination of those willing to observe patiently. And as the evening continues to fade into night, it is calming to reflect on the continuity of these patterns. Even centuries later, we can observe the soft, persistent rhythm of aristocratic life, the gentle orchestration of fragile heirs, the careful attention to eccentricities, and the repeated habits that quietly shaped dynasties. This slow, deliberate unfolding of events is hypnotically absorbing, providing a gentle meditation on patience, endurance, and human adaptability. So, as the evening continues to fade into night, we can settle into the comforting realization that European history, particularly the lives of royalty, is often less about spectacle and more about subtle persistence. Catherine de Medici, her children, minor royals, and countless courtiers collectively maintained a quiet, enduring rhythm, a soft pulse that continues to fascinate and soothe the imagination of those willing to observe patiently.
Part 15. The Gentle Threads of Fragility and Endurance. As we move further along the quiet corridors of history, it is soothing to observe how European royalty functioned less as dramatic figures and more as participants in a slow, deliberate rhythm of life. Catherine de Medici, her children, and their contemporaries offer a prime example of this hypnotic continuity. Every gesture, repeated habit, and measured decision contributed to a pattern of survival and subtle influence that extended quietly across decades. Even minor courtiers, tutors, and distant relatives played essential roles. Their days unfolded with careful attention to routine, preparing rooms, arranging letters, supervising fragile children, and ensuring ceremonial details were maintained. These small, repetitive actions, often overlooked in grand histories, formed the foundation of dynastic continuity. Imagine the calm, almost meditative rhythm of these lives, deliberate, measured, and consistent, yet quietly shaping the broader currents of European politics and culture.
Fragility remained central to aristocratic life. Children were born delicate, often inheriting predispositions to illness or unusual temperaments. Generations of inbreeding amplified these traits. Yet, the aristocracy responded with careful observation, subtle adjustments, and patient endurance. Meals were measured, activities restricted, and health monitored with meticulous attention. These gentle interventions, repeated across decades, allowed fragile heirs to survive and dynasties to endure. Eccentricity was equally woven into the hypnotic tapestry. Monarchs obsessed with ritual, fashion, astrology, art, or curiosities created structure and subtle order in courtly life. Rudolph II's fascination with alchemy, Louis XIV's ceremonial routines, and Peter the Great's meticulous daily habits exemplify how eccentric behavior reinforced continuity. These repeated, deliberate habits added texture and rhythm, shaping both perception and influence in aristocratic households. Catherine's legacy echoes throughout these patterns. Her patient orchestration of her children, careful guidance of alliances, and subtle management of courtly pressures set a template for subsequent generations. Her methods, quiet observation, gentle adjustment, and persistent endurance rippled through her descendants and beyond, influencing minor royals, courtiers, and the broader patterns of European aristocracy. Observing this continuity provides a hypnotic sense of order, patience, and subtle influence. Even tragedies fit seamlessly into this rhythm. The early deaths of children, illnesses of heirs, and minor political setbacks were integrated into daily life with calm acceptance. Loss was absorbed gradually, grief managed quietly, and adjustments were made with care. There is a calm pattern here. Events, no matter how poignant, move through time slowly, measured by patience, observation, and subtle orchestration. Across centuries, the hypnotic pulse persists. Fragile heirs guided carefully, eccentric monarchs moving deliberately, courtiers maintaining gentle order, and repeated habits combining to sustain dynasties. Catherine de Medici and her descendants exemplify this enduring rhythm. Their lives remind us that history is often less about dramatic spectacle and more about subtle persistence, the quiet, continuous unfolding of human action and influence over time. And as we drift toward the final reflections tonight, it is calming to recognize this continuous, soporific pattern. European royal life, fragile and eccentric as it was, operated on slow, deliberate currents. Every small act, routine, habit, subtle management, ripples outward, forming a soft, persistent pulse that carries across generations. This is the hypnotic essence of aristocratic life, the gentle, continuous rhythm of endurance, subtlety, and careful orchestration. In the final quiet of reflection, we can appreciate the soothing continuity of these lives. Catherine de Medici, her children, minor royals, and courtiers all participated in this meditative rhythm. Their patience, careful observation, and gentle endurance form a tapestry that is mesmerizing when observed slowly. The fascination lies not in spectacle or drama, but in the calm, continuous unfolding of human life across generations, a hypnotic reminder of patience, subtle influence, and enduring patterns of fragility and eccentricity.
Part 16. Meditative Reflections on Royal Life and Enduring Patterns. As we drift further into the quiet folds of history, it is calming to observe that European royalty was less about spectacle and more about subtle, continuous patterns of endurance. Catherine de Medici, her children, and countless contemporaries exemplify this gentle rhythm.
Their lives were filled with small, deliberate actions, repeated habits, and patient orchestration of fragile households, a hypnotic cadence that persisted quietly across generations. Minor courtiers, distant relatives, and overlooked heirs also contributed to this flow. Each day unfolded with slow, deliberate routines, preparing rooms, observing ceremonial protocols, attending to delicate children, and transmitting subtle advice. These seemingly trivial actions collectively sustained dynastic continuity. Imagining these lives unfolding slowly, almost meditatively, offers a soothing perspective. Human history is not always dramatic. It can also be quiet, steady, and hypnotically absorbing. Fragility remained a defining element. Children born delicate, suffering from inherited illnesses or predispositions, required patient observation and careful adjustment. Inbreeding compounded these vulnerabilities, yet households adapted. Diets were measured, activities gently restricted, and routines meticulously maintained. Over time, these small interventions ensured survival, subtly shaping the course of dynasties. Observing this slow, measured care is mesmerizing, a quiet testament to patience and endurance. Eccentricity also shaped the hypnotic rhythm of aristocratic life. Monarchs obsessed with ritual, fashion, astrology, and curiosities created structure and subtle order within their courts. Louis XIV's ceremonial routines, Rudolph II's artistic and alchemical pursuits, and Peter the Great's meticulously managed days all exemplify how eccentric behavior contributed to continuity. These repeated patterns of habit and obsession reinforced stability, shaping both perception and influence across generations. Catherine's enduring legacy can be traced through these patterns. Her patient guidance, subtle orchestration, and careful management of courtly pressures became a model for her children, minor royals, and courtiers alike. Observing how her approach echoed across Europe is hypnotically absorbing. Subtle influence, careful adjustment, and quiet endurance, shaping generations. There is almost a meditative quality in noticing how these patterns persist quietly, unseen, yet powerful. Even small tragedies were absorbed into this rhythm. The early deaths of children, illnesses of heirs, and minor political failures were quietly incorporated into daily life. Loss was processed slowly, adjustments made with care, and continuity maintained. This gentle absorption of misfortune is a hallmark of aristocratic life, a rhythm of quiet endurance, repeated habits, and subtle adaptation. Across centuries, these threads weave a hypnotic tapestry. Fragile heirs, eccentric monarchs, diligent courtiers, and repeated routines collectively sustain dynasties. Catherine de Medici and her contemporaries remind us that history often flows not in dramatic bursts, but in soft, persistent currents. This slow, continuous rhythm, shaped by patience, subtle influence, and quiet orchestration, defines the hypnotic essence of European aristocracy. As we near the final reflections tonight, it is calming to contemplate the continuity of these lives. The repeated habits, careful observations, subtle management of fragility, and gentle endurance create a soft, immersive experience. Observing these patterns slowly allows us to appreciate a different kind of history, one defined by calm persistence rather than spectacle, by delicate orchestration rather than explosive events. In the final quiet of our journey, Catherine de Medici, her children, minor royals, and courtiers fade gently into the background of time. Their patient endurance, subtle influence, and measured habits leave behind a hypnotic legacy, a continuous rhythm of life and fragility, of eccentricity and care, of quiet adaptation and persistence. It is in this gentle, enduring pattern that we find the calm fascination of European aristocracy, not dramatic, not loud, but softly persistent and endlessly absorbing. And with that, we can let the story settle, like a soft echo fading through the corridors of history, leaving only the gentle, continuous rhythm of life in the courts of Europe, a rhythm to drift alongside, quietly, calmly, and hypnotically.
Part 17. The final echoes of royal patterns and gentle continuity. As we settle into the last reflections of tonight's journey, it's soothing to realize that the story of European royalty is less about dramatic events and more about the quiet, persistent rhythms of life. Catherine de Medici, her children, and countless minor royals, courtiers, and distant relatives all participated in a subtle, hypnotic flow, a measured orchestration of fragile lives, eccentric habits, and enduring influence. Even in their apparent fragility, these figures shaped the slow-moving currents of history. Children with delicate health, heirs with unusual temperaments, and minor courtiers performing repetitive, measured tasks all contributed to the continuity of dynasties. Their days unfolded in soft, deliberate routines, attending ceremonies, observing protocol, studying, corresponding, or simply existing within carefully structured patterns. It is in this quiet repetition that we find the mesmerizing cadence of aristocratic life. Fragility and eccentricity were never obstacles, but integral elements of this rhythm. Inbreeding, predispositions to illness, and peculiar habits were carefully managed, integrated into daily routines, and absorbed into courtly life. Monarchs obsessed with ceremonial detail, astrology, fashion, or curiosities added structure and texture, reinforcing continuity while shaping perception. The cumulative effect of these repeated, measured actions is hypnotically calming, a steady pulse that persists through generations. Catherine's legacy echoes gently through these patterns. Her patient orchestration, subtle adjustments, and quiet management of fragile heirs provided a template for later generations. Her children and their descendants internalized these methods, minor courtiers mirrored them, and the broader aristocracy carried forward a rhythm of measured endurance. There is a meditative quality in observing this continuity. Influence exerted not through spectacle, but through persistent, subtle repetition. Even the small tragedies, the early deaths, frailty, or minor setbacks fit into the rhythm naturally. Grief was absorbed gradually, adjustments made carefully, and the gentle flow of courtly life continued uninterrupted. This slow, measured integration of adversity into daily routines exemplifies the hypnotic cadence of aristocratic life, quiet, deliberate, and continuous. Across centuries, the patterns repeat. Fragile heirs guided with care, eccentric monarchs moving deliberately, minor courtiers maintaining order, and repeated routines collectively form a tapestry of continuity. Catherine de Medici, her children, and the broader European aristocracy remind us that history often unfolds not in dramatic bursts, but in soft, persistent waves. The hypnotic essence of royal life lies in this continuity. Patient endurance, subtle influence, and gentle orchestration shaping generations. As we allow our reflections to drift gently into the quiet, we can appreciate the calming, immersive nature of this history. European royalty, with all its fragility, eccentricity, and minor tragedies, demonstrates a continuous rhythm of life, a rhythm that is subtle, soothing, and endlessly absorbing. The courts, the children, the courtiers, and the careful routines form a tapestry that is hypnotic in its persistence. And now, as our journey comes to its soft conclusion, we can let the echoes of Catherine de Medici and her contemporaries fade slowly into memory. The patient endurance, subtle guidance, and measured habits of these aristocratic lives leave behind a lasting rhythm, a quiet, continuous pulse of history that lulls the mind into reflection. This is the hypnotic legacy of European royalty, not in spectacle or drama, but in the gentle, persistent flow of human life, fragility, and eccentricity across generations.
Part 18. Gentle ripples of history and the soft echoes of aristocracy. Even as centuries pass, the quiet lives of royals, their children, and courtiers leave gentle ripples in history. Catherine de Medici and her descendants provide a perfect lens through which to observe this subtle hypnotic flow. Their days were measured and deliberate, filled with small routines, careful observations, and patient adjustments. Every minor habit, repeated ceremony, and quiet act of management contributed to the enduring rhythm of aristocratic life. Consider the overlooked figures who seldom appear in history books: distant cousins, minor princesses, and frail heirs living under strict observation. Their lives moved slowly, framed by careful schedules and repeated rituals. Meals, study sessions, prayers, letters, and ceremonial duties punctuated the day in a gentle, hypnotic pattern. Though seemingly insignificant, these actions maintained the stability of dynasties, ensured the survival of heirs, and shaped the flow of European history in subtle, continuous ways. Fragility remained a constant theme. Inbreeding, delicate constitutions, and inherited illnesses demanded patient care. Courtiers and physicians monitored children closely, adjusted routines, and managed diets with meticulous attention. Every intervention, repeated over years and across generations, contributed to survival and continuity. This slow, deliberate process creates a mesmerizing rhythm, the quiet unfolding of influence and life, far from dramatic spectacle, yet profoundly enduring. Eccentricity, too, was part of the hypnotic pattern. Monarchs obsessed with ritual, fashion, astrology, curiosities, and architecture integrated their obsessions into courtly life, producing structure and predictability. Louis XIV's ceremonial routines, Rudolph II's alchemical interests, and Peter the Great's meticulously managed schedules illustrate how repeated eccentric behaviors shaped perception and maintained continuity. Observing these small, deliberate habits reveals the mesmerizing order underlying aristocratic chaos. Catherine's influence resonates subtly through all of this. Her patient guidance, careful orchestration, and quiet adjustments set a template followed by children, courtiers, and even minor royals. Her legacy is not in dramatic acts or notorious scandals, but in slow, continuous patterns of observation, subtle intervention, and endurance. Watching these patterns echo through time is hypnotically calming. Influence exerted softly, yet persistently across generations. Even small tragedies fit naturally into this rhythm. The early deaths of children, illnesses of heirs, and minor political setbacks were incorporated gradually into daily life. Loss was processed slowly, adjustments were made with care, and continuity endured. This soft, deliberate management of misfortune exemplifies the hypnotic cadence of aristocratic life. Life persists quietly, measured by patience, subtlety, and repetition. Across centuries, this rhythm repeats. Fragile heirs are guided gently, eccentric monarchs move deliberately, and minor courtiers maintain order. Repeated routines sustain dynasties and shape perception, all without dramatic upheaval. Catherine de Medici and her contemporaries demonstrate that history often flows in soft, persistent waves, rather than sharp, sudden bursts. The hypnotic essence of royal life lies precisely in this subtle, continuous cadence. As we drift further into reflection, it is calming to consider the enduring influence of these lives. European royalty, with all its fragility, eccentricity, and minor tragedies, offers a soothing perspective. Patient endurance, careful observation, and repeated habits quietly shaping history. Catherine and her descendants leave behind a legacy of subtle influence and hypnotic continuity, a rhythm that continues to absorb and calm anyone willing to observe patiently. Finally, as night deepens and sleep draws near, we can let the echoes of aristocratic life fade slowly. The careful orchestration of fragile heirs, the quiet management of eccentric monarchs, and the persistent habits of minor courtiers form a gentle, continuous pulse, a soft rhythm of human life stretching across generations. Observing this rhythm, one can drift along with it, carried gently through the corridors of European history, until all that remains is calm, subtle fascination, and the hypnotic continuity of aristocratic life.
Part 19. Quiet Legacies and the Persistent Flow of Aristocracy. Even in the quieter corners of European history, the lives of royals, their children, and their courtiers contribute to a gentle, enduring rhythm. Catherine de Medici and her descendants exemplify this slow, persistent cadence. Days unfolded with deliberate precision, measured routines, careful observation, and subtle adjustments that collectively sustained dynasties and shaped perception. The hypnotic charm of these lives lies in their quiet constancy. Minor courtiers and overlooked heirs played essential roles in this slow-moving flow. Their daily lives revolved around repeated routines, preparing correspondence, observing ceremonial norms, monitoring the health of fragile heirs, and performing small, structured duties. Though individually unremarkable, these actions reinforced continuity and stability, weaving a soft tapestry of aristocratic life. Observing this delicate machinery in motion is calming, almost meditative, as each movement flows seamlessly into the next. Fragility remained a defining thread. Inbreeding and inherited illnesses ensured that children and heirs often required careful, patient attention. Courtiers and physicians monitored diets, activity levels, and moods with meticulous care. Each minor intervention, repeated consistently, contributed to survival and the slow unfolding of dynasties. There is a hypnotic fascination in imagining these measured adjustments, day after day, generation after generation. Eccentricity, too, contributed to the gentle rhythm. Monarchs obsessed with rituals, fashions, curiosities, and astrology created subtle order in the chaos of courtly life. Louis XIV's meticulously timed ceremonies, Rudolph II's artistic obsessions, and Peter the Great's disciplined daily routines illustrate how repeated eccentric habits reinforced continuity and shaped perception. These behaviors, observed carefully and repeated endlessly, produce a soft, absorbing pulse that permeates aristocratic history. Catherine's influence persists quietly through these patterns. Her patient orchestration, careful adjustments, and subtle guidance became a template for children, courtiers, and minor royals. Influence was exerted not dramatically, but gently, quietly, and persistently. This is the hypnotic beauty of her legacy: subtle repetition, careful observation, and measured endurance shaping generations. Even minor tragedies, the early death of a child, illness of an heir, or political setbacks, fit seamlessly into this rhythm. Loss was absorbed slowly, adjustments made carefully, and life continued without interruption. The hypnotic aspect lies in the calm continuity. Aristocratic life persisted gently, measured by patience, observation, and deliberate repetition. Across centuries, this soft pulse repeats. Fragile heirs guided with care, eccentric monarchs moving deliberately, minor courtiers maintaining order, and repeated routines combine to sustain dynasties.
Catherine de Medici, her children, and countless contemporaries illustrate that history often unfolds not in sudden bursts, but in continuous, gentle waves. The hypnotic essence of European aristocracy resides in this subtle, persistent cadence. As we drift further into the quiet of reflection, it is soothing to consider the continuity of these lives. The repeated habits, careful observation, and patient endurance form a tapestry that quietly shapes history. European royalty, fragile and eccentric though it was, leaves a hypnotic rhythm, a gentle, continuous pulse that absorbs the mind and soothes the imagination. Finally, as the evening deepens, we can allow the soft echoes of aristocratic life to fade gently. Catherine de Medici, her children, minor royals, and courtiers leave behind a continuous rhythm of fragility, eccentricity, and subtle influence. Observing this rhythm slowly allows us to drift alongside it, carried gently through the centuries of European history, until all that remains is calm, fascination, and the hypnotic continuity of aristocratic life.
Part 20. The last part. Drift into the gentle continuity of royal life. And now, as we settle into the final reflections of tonight's journey, it is soothing to consider the entirety of what we have observed. European royalty, particularly the life and legacy of Catherine de Medici, is less about dramatic events, wars, or spectacular scandal, and far more about the soft, persistent rhythm of daily existence. The patient orchestration of fragile heirs, the careful guidance of eccentric monarchs, and the repeated, measured routines of minor courtiers combine to form a gentle, hypnotic cadence that endures across generations. Catherine herself remains central to this pattern. Her life was a study in quiet influence, subtle orchestration of her children, careful management of courtly pressures, and patient observation of fragile dynasties. She did not need to raise her voice or command attention to shape history. Instead, her influence flowed gently, continuously, like a slow river carving its path over decades. Watching this subtle shaping unfold is mesmerizing, a calm, soporific reminder that power often moves most effectively in quiet, persistent ways. Minor figures, courtiers, distant cousins, and lesser-known heirs all contribute to this hypnotic flow. Their days were structured, their actions measured, their attention constant. Every letter sent, room prepared, ceremonial duty performed, or fragile child observed reinforced the stability and continuity of aristocratic life. Individually, these actions might appear insignificant. Collectively, however, they form a soft, enduring pulse that quietly shapes dynasties, societies, and perceptions over centuries. Fragility remained ever present. Inbreeding, delicate constitutions, and inherited illnesses required patience, care, and continuous attention. Meals were measured, activities monitored, and health carefully observed. These subtle interventions, repeated over decades, ensured survival and continuity. There is a hypnotic fascination in this slow, deliberate management, the gentle, persistent rhythm that underpins aristocratic endurance. Eccentricity also contributed to the soothing cadence of life in these courts. Monarchs obsessed with ritual, fashion, astrology, curiosities, or art created structure and subtle order. Louis XIV's meticulously timed ceremonies, Rudolph II's artistic obsessions, and Peter the Great's disciplined schedules illustrate how eccentric behavior, when repeated carefully, reinforced continuity.
These eccentricities, observed and perpetuated over years, are part of the hypnotic tapestry, a calm, persistent pulse threading through the fabric of history. Even minor tragedies, early deaths, illness, political setbacks were absorbed into daily life. Loss was processed gradually, adjustments made with care, and the gentle flow of aristocratic life continued uninterrupted. This deliberate, measured response to adversity is central to the hypnotic rhythm we've observed, soft, continuous, and soothing in its constancy. Across centuries, the patterns repeat. Fragile heirs guided gently, eccentric monarchs moving deliberately, minor courtiers maintaining order, and repeated routines sustaining dynasties. Catherine de Medici and her descendants remind us that history often flows not in dramatic bursts, but in soft, persistent waves. The hypnotic essence of royal life lies precisely in this subtle, continuous cadence, a rhythm of endurance, subtle influence, and careful orchestration that stretches across generations. And so, as night deepens and we allow our reflections to settle, the soft echoes of aristocratic life fade gently into memory. Catherine de Medici, her children, minor royals, and courtiers leave behind a legacy of quiet, continuous rhythm. Patient endurance, subtle influence, delicate management, and repeated habits form a hypnotic pulse that lulls the mind, gently draws attention to the continuous flow of human life, and soothes the imagination. As we close this extended journey, we can drift along that pulse. The delicate patterns of fragility, eccentricity, and quiet orchestration continue across the centuries, a mesmerizing reminder of how influence, life, and history persist gently, deliberately, and persistently. European royalty, far from loud spectacle, offers a calm, immersive meditation, a continuous, soporific rhythm to carry the listener slowly, gently, into reflection, and eventually, restful sleep. With that, we leave the quiet corridors of history behind, the gentle patterns of aristocratic life fading softly, and the legacy of Catherine de Medici and her world resting peacefully in the mind.